This next session is on product innovation in online gaming and sports betting, and I'm so excited about this topic that I'm going to stick around and moderate this panel. I'm going to really quickly run through our lineup of panelists here. We have Lloyd Danzig, who is the managing partner of Sharp Alpha Funds, and they're a VC firm focused on the sports betting space. We have next to him Zach Sold, who is director of digital at BetMGM, which hopefully many of you here are familiar with. We have Anna Sainsbury, who is the co-founder and CEO of GeoComply, a huge service provider to the industry with geolocation services and compliance services. Next to her, we've got Tomash Devenishek, who is the co-founder and CEO of Kero Sports. And last but not least, we have Matt Heiman, who is the founder and CEO of The Game Day. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. We spent a lot of time this morning talking about this really hyper-competitive sports betting market that we're in here in North America. If we think back on, the years since PASPA was repealed and how the markets has evolved, it seemed like we started off with this big land grab phase, right? Operators rushing into the space, strategically expanding into new markets, and for lack of a better word, buying customers, right? Huge promotions, splashy marketing campaigns to reach audiences. And now it seems like this next phase, new operators that are coming in are all talking about product differentiation and how that's going to be the name of the game. I'd love to kind of start off with a big question. When we think through the lens of innovation, and I'll kick it off with you because you work with a lot of different players in this space. What do you think is really going to differentiate the winners and the losers in the North American market when we think about the product innovation side of things?
I think the key area that a lot of operators are focused on at the moment, in particular this year, is really usability. And us going back and looking at, had so much growth. Each market in the US is quite different from the other. And we've had a lot of requirements when we look at that player funnel. So we are spending a lot of money advertising to players and getting them on our sites. And we need to look at how are we getting them through that player funnel, and then how are we engaging them over time, and is it a good experience? And so now that we have a little bit of time to step back, although this year we've opened up 2 of our biggest markets, focusing on that and making sure that we have the right messaging, the right education for the users so that they know what to expect in terms of geolocation, age and identity, getting money onto the online site, and then also, of course, engaging them with great products and integrating those products into land-based casinos, especially because we've seen a lot of traffic in the casinos. So those have been the real conversations that we've been having with our partners over the past few months.
And Lloyd, I'd love to get your take on this as well, since you're working with a lot of the startups that are helping, move innovation along in this space.
I think we're now starting to move from the customer acquisition, market access gold rush phase into the customer retention and unit economics optimization phase. And a lot of that is being done through various forms of differentiation. Some companies are differentiating based on their business models. Circa has a very different business model from DraftKings. Some differentiating by way of brand, media, in-house personalities, the communities that get built around those, and then others by product. Right now, the majority of product and technological infrastructure that exists was imported from other parts of the world that had more and longer developed gambling markets. But there are very different consumer preferences here in the US than in many of those regions. In particular, people here are a lot more focused on the social and entertainment side of betting. And in a lot of ways, the current product landscape is not only undifferentiated, but really fails to speak to and harvest a lot of those consumer preferences. And in many cases, large operators, not that they are incapable or lack the intellectual aptitude to innovate, but they're resource constrained. Every new state that legalizes sports betting basically requires its own go-to-market strategy and a team of lawyers and lobbyists and hundreds of millions of dollars in advertising spend. And so that, combined with the technical debt that a lot of companies have amassed, makes it easier or makes it more advantageous for a lot of startups to engage in innovation. Startups are often a lot more coherently tapped into the needs of sometimes themselves, if people are building products that they themselves see missing in the market, or in general are able to address certain consumer needs, iterate a lot more quickly. I was talking to a large operator recently and pitching them on a moderately novel and innovative idea, and their response was something to the effect of, we don't even have teasers working properly across all the states right now. There's no way we can even consider this. And it may or may not have been Zach right here who said that. I wasn't going to call him out, but okay, there you go.
We're not allowed to talk about other operators outside of BetMGM on this panel. So.
And so the point being, there may be a lot of product innovations that ultimately reach the mass market with a DraftKings or FanDuel or MGM logo and stamp on them, but a lot of those product innovations will originate among earlier stage, more nimble companies that can more adroitly target what it is that is not currently being tapped in terms of unmet consumer preferences.
And I mean, to that point, there's a lot to think about when we talk about innovation, right? That's a big word that spans a lot of things, from things like loyalty and how you engage users to all the elements under the hood, as Anna was talking about. Zach, I'd love to, get your opinion on this. Being at an operator, how do you set your priorities? What are the biggest pain points that you need to address in 2022 versus what can wait, maybe 2, 3, 4 years down the line?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that there's a certain threshold of basic and sort of commoditized product features that everybody needs to be able to nail in order to compete at the highest level, right? So once you've sort of made that checkbox, I would put teasers on that list of features that you need to have. Things like single account across all states where you can dynamically transfer funds, and you have one account that is for New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and so on. Once you nail those sort of like expected commoditized features, then it's about competing where you think you can win. So you mentioned loyalty, and I think that that's an area where BetMGM is obviously investing a ton of resource, just when you can tie together your sort of MGM retail rewards program, which is obviously has a massive database and a massive following, and a ton of people that are already using it, and tie that in with your digital properties in order to drive more handle via sports betting, online gaming, even bingo products when you launch them, and really communicate with a single customer based upon a single customer ID in a cohesive way that pushes them into that sort of omni-channel world where when a person shows up at the Bellagio, it's the same person who's using BetMGM when they go back to Michigan. Same thing when they go to the MGM Grand in Detroit, and really communicating with that person cohesively and making sure that they're leveraging all of the products in your sort of suite. That's a huge priority for us. And you sort of have to identify, where can we compete, where can we win? And when it comes to like diversity of products, obviously we're not going to launch a DFS site. That's already pretty well established, and there's more of a way of other operators that are going to successfully drive customers between one product vertical to another within the digital environment. So for us, it's about tying together, how can we tie together our retail operation with our digital properties in order to drive just the best and most retentive omni-channel flywheel for BetMGM.
That makes a lot of sense. Tomash, I'd love to get your opinion on this as well, because we've been talking mainly from the operator point of view, but you work with a lot of other stakeholders, sports teams and leagues who are trying to engage their fan base around sports betting and gaming as well. What do you think about that?
Yeah, well, we try and look at it from a user experience, right? Because I think the sports fan is not so different from a sports bettor, although obviously they mean different things. But in the future, if you imagine that a lot more adoption is going to happen in the space, then you're probably, as you try and anticipate, what does that experience look like 5 years from now or 2 years from now? Certainly one aspect that lends itself nicely today is, how do people consume entertainment, right? How is, when you open up your phone, what is it that happens to you? And the answer is very much instant gratification, and it's highly real time. And what gives you that is the algorithmic curation capabilities of those platforms like TikTok, Instagram, et cetera. And so as we try and think about, well, how will people consume sports and sports betting, algorithmic curation, and I'll touch on that in a second, is one key, and then social is another, and I know Lloyd brought that up. And so what does algorithmic curation really mean for you? It means that when you tune into the second period of a hockey game, you're not just seeing a line that was made 3 days in the past and the line has moved, but rather something highly contextual, because if one team just won if the Rangers won on a power play, you probably want to bet on the outcome of that power play. And so being able to deliver those types of micro betting, in-game micro betting experiences and making that social is something that seems to be appealing across the board, not just to operators, but also to the leagues and the teams, because they're trying to get a lot more engagement with their content as well. And so that's kind of how we see it in this holistic, what is the next gen version of the user experience.
And to that point on social and entertainment, we're seeing some of the big sports betting platforms, companies like DraftKings say that, social is going to be a big focus for them in the coming year. DraftKings in particular is adding, features like social betting groups. They're looking to incorporate user-generated video and the like. What do you think ultimately is the future of social and entertainment in this space? Is it going to be that that this becomes an inherent part of all of the sports books moving forward? Is it something that, Meta, these other big social platforms that you think are going to want to, dive into in the future? Do these communities end up on Discord or somewhere in the like? Matt, where do you think this is all headed?
Yeah, it's a timely question. I mean, the Game Day has one of our board members as a senior exec, so top 10 or 20 exec at Meta. And we had a board meeting on Monday, and it came up, where does this play in terms of the integration between the platform and the data that we get from the platform as a publisher. So, for example, BetMGM is one of our clients. In my previous business, it was actually acquired by Sky, and we had 450, 500 million people a month watching our content, all on social, where we get an incredible data scrape. When we were bought by Sky, they owned Sky Bet. And at the time, it was a $1 billion business. When it ultimately sold, it was a £3 to £4 billion pound business. And what we did by understanding the left-hand need, which was the operator, with the right-hand data, which was 450 to 500 million people a month watching our content, is we could create cohorts and understand activity at a level that's incredible. And it's at a level that right now it is church and state. And when we post-acquisition, it was no longer church and state, we're all under one banner. It made it very easy for me and Richard to sit down and his team to sit down and say, listen, who are the 100 million people you want to get to? When do you want to get to them? What does that campaign look like? What does the data look like? More importantly, what does a good better look like? Have we spent your money appropriately or inappropriately? Are you making money? Should we actually be thinking about this on a rev share basis so that we're both aligned? And how do we integrate our tech, which is pretty easy to do because we have a lot of data, like a fire hose of it. So that was 2018, but I remember asking Richard, how did you create Sky Bet? There were already 22 operators in the UK. Tech was really not the innovation, right? It was all the same platforms, all third-party licensed tech. And he said, mobile. And I said, when? And he said, 2012, 2013. And I was like, but the iPhone had been around for 4 or 5 years by then. How was that an innovation? And he said, nobody went for it. And I think the piece that's really interesting is that there's little simple things like let's focus on mobile because that's where consumers are at. That if you actually focus on that and dedicate to it, he created a massive company. In the same way as I think some of our partners will understand when the left hand and the right hand cooperate in terms of data. Already we're 18 months old since our first post. We're doing 100 million US 18 to 35-year-old touch points a month. And there's no operator who's coming to us and saying, what kind of data do you have? And I think that's very interesting. I think we have 4.5 million, 5 million likes, comments, shares a week where we have all that data, right? We know we know who the human being is. We're interacting with them. No operator is coming to us and saying, let's do something with that. And those aren't difficult tweaks. That's like Richard focusing on mobile, right? That's not hard work. That's just somebody saying, actually, I want to have profitable customers.
Do you think we see some sort of a new startup, a third party kind of emerge and become the platform where, bettors and other sports-minded folks are kind of interacting and engaging?
There certainly are a number that are trying to be such a platform. But I also think it's an interesting time where operators, DraftKings has rolled out a number of social features, as you mentioned. In the US, people have a very different sociocultural orientation towards sports betting than many other places on earth, especially the places from which we've imported the technology and products that exist today. I think a great example of this is you walk into or Google a picture of a William Hill betting parlor in even the nicest part of London, and it looks kind of like an ATM vestibule or a post office where you get in, you very efficiently find the information, place a bet, and get out. Whereas at a Las Vegas sportsbook, for the majority of people there, whether a team's minus 120 or minus 125 is probably the least important facet of that entire experience. And of course, operators want social and entertainment-seeking, non-price-sensitive sports bettors. That's kind of the ultimate cohort that you go after. And on top of that, I think an interesting opportunity, we'll see to what extent it can be harvested. Sportsbooks historically have not really achieved or leveraged any degree of network effects. There's no incremental benefit to me to joining the sportsbook that more people are using or that more of my friends are using. Yes, sometimes FanDuel and DraftKings do the promotions where every 1,000 people who bet on a particular outcome move the spread for everyone in one direction, and that's a small example. But if you think about the other user experiences that your typical core sports bettor is partaking in, if I have Netflix and all of my friends have Hulu, we're not going to be able to talk about and quote the same shows. If I have PlayStation and all my friends have Xbox, we're not going to be able to play against each other in FIFA, or I guess it's not going to be called FIFA anymore. It's going to be called EAFC. The point is that most of these platforms in and around sports betting have figured out a way to entice users to stay on the same platform as their friends and as more users. And even in season-long fantasy and DFS, I use Yahoo Fantasy for my season-long football, not necessarily because it's the best platform, because I've been playing with the same group of people for 15 years in the same league, and it's just easy for someone to press one button that says, send out the invitation for this year's draft to all of those. And so I think one of the most compelling aspects of social functionality, if an operator can successfully implement it, is that it adds a sense of network effects and stickiness and retention that right now I think is lacking in an environment where there really is minimal, if any, brand loyalty.
That's a great point. Shifting gears a little bit as we kind of stick on this topic of where is this innovation coming from. Zach, I'd love to come back to you because, you know, as an operator, you have lots of options. You can buy, right? You can acquire a new piece of technology that maybe has a social function that could give you this kind of network effects that Lloyd was talking about. You can rent and work with a third party, or you can work and try to build it in-house yourself. What does that decision-making process look like for you?
Yeah, I mean, so it's you know, relatively standard sort of business case that you're trying to build out. I mean, for us and for I think a lot of operators, Lloyd pointed this out, but it's like when a new market opens up, it's an absolute mandate to be there on day one, which means a lot of your development and technology and product resources get realigned to say, okay, well, Ontario is a 3-product market. We need to make sure that we're there on day one with sports betting, poker, and casino, right? So it's like there's a certain amount of resource that you need to earmark or just ring fence for making sure that you hit certain deadlines for new product markets, and that's going to remain the case for a relatively long time. So it's, okay, what do we have left? What does our priority list look like? And what are the real innovative opportunities that we can go and white label? I'd say each operator is making those decisions based upon what their development resource looks like. You know, for us, we're much more open to the white label solution, I think, than a lot of other operators might be, who can say, we can build this ourselves without having to go out and buy it. But the fact of the matter is, it's much more cost effective for most operators to go out and say, here's a startup that's doing this really effectively. We can white label their solution and have social features, right, embedded right within the BetMGM app or the PointsBet app or wherever it is, without having to sort of align where our tech resources are going, making sure that we're hitting California or Texas or Florida when it comes around, without scaling our team and taking on the operational overhead that comes with that. So I think it's really just a cost benefit analysis, and depending on what sort of priorities from a product perspective you want to have jump the list and you want to make sure you're hitting in a certain time frame, and then finding technology providers that align with that. I think the problem that a lot of operators are starting to see with the white label model is when a white label provider becomes so popular that it goes from being an offensive tactic, meaning we have this and it's a differentiator and nobody else has it, to a defensive tactic of everybody has this, we're all paying the same price, and now they sort of own they sort of have the leverage over us in terms of increasing that price because you can't not have it within your product stack in order to compete. So there's a lot of talk about exclusivity when it comes to white label providers on the product side. That obviously comes with it's expensive. So it's interesting to see who pops up to compete with one another as well. It's going to become, I think, a little bit more operator specific, who's working with, for example, one social feature provider versus another. and having them compete with one another so that we can maintain that sort of sense of this is an offensive tactic of innovation rather than a defensive tactic of we're going to lose out on market share if we don't have this feature.
Of it being a cost-benefit analysis is exactly correct. And it's a different cost-benefit analysis for each operator and for each use case. And just so, for example, in some use cases, being differentiated and being the only one that has something is extremely important. In others, like geolocation, for example, as long as it works and locates the person really quickly, DraftKings probably doesn't care if FanDuel is using the same backend technology, and that's why GeoComply basically has a monopoly on geolocation right now and works with almost every single operator, whereas there are other cases where it may make more sense to build if differentiation is absolutely paramount. It's also why I start to see a lot of quasi-exclusive deals with white label providers where an operator will say, we will integrate this and sign an X-year deal with you, but you cannot be integrated with more than 3 other U.S. operators at any given time. But it really just does come down to the cost-benefit analysis, as Zach said.
And regulatory considerations sort of operate outside of this framework, honestly, because that's an existential issue, right? If you're not, accommodating what the regulator requirements are in a state, you can lose your license for not doing that. So it's like regulator providers tend to get a pass on this sort of exclusivity, offensive versus defensive tactic like mindset. Whereas it's really like the more innovative product sets, feature sets that we're looking for a little bit more, like we want to have some sort of differentiator based upon some commercial relationship with the provider.
And Anna, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in there on, product innovation. And Matt, you kind of mentioned it over time with what Sky was doing. And I know when we opened up in the US market, mobile and poker were all we were talking about. And mobile and poker was hard to be good at 10 years ago when network connection was slow, battery drain was a massive consideration. We needed to start looking at how we were going to geolocate. And before we were on the market, a lot of the regulators were wanting us to look at GPS data. And you can imagine, you sit in a tournament, you're playing poker for 3 hours, and we're pinging your geolocation because you're sitting on the New Jersey-New York border every couple of seconds to make sure you don't cross that bridge. And so sometimes what we see, especially in this market, there's this like period of time of like, what is the platform? What is the internet bandwidth? Like how many people do we need on these sites in order to have an engaging social experience, right? And especially with liquidity, it was a big issue, which is why we saw Delaware and New Jersey sign up together because there just wasn't a huge population in both locations that were making an engaging experience. So I think a lot of what we look at when we look at innovating in this space is like, where is the market at? Like, what are the regulators willing to consider? What is licensable? What is going to help us get into each market? We're all in a race to get to every market first. You have to be there. You have to be ready. And you also need to sign on partners that can get there with you, right? And having that capacity and that licensing team and whatnot to facilitate that. So there's so much to consider when we're looking at how we can create these multi-state solutions that engage both our land-based requirements and online and bringing that together. And I think that sewing in like how the hardware and how users are interacting with our companies is really important as much as what the regulators' considerations are and actually how we can innovate in some way.
That's right. There's a lot more nuance to all these discussions. We've touched a couple of times on the point of resources and, of course, the market's sentiment on the overall online sports betting industry has changed a lot in the last 12 months, particularly as it relates to valuation, sort of getting a reality check. I'm curious to hear from you all. Do you find that is having any sort of a dampening effect on how many resources are being put towards things like product innovation right now?
I would say from our side, yes. It's sort of on two ends, right? Like when margin is slightly lower than you're expecting on one product or another, that will manifest itself in not so much. I guess we're not seeing as much of a pullback generally in product innovation and development. We're seeing it more on the marketing side. Okay. So when you aren't getting the same amount of average like revenue per customer that you acquire, obviously that factors into your cost per acquisition projections. And then when you have states that regulated a 51% tax rate of GGR, it makes it very difficult to justify marketing investment, knowing that there's the window of making that investment back, regardless of what your CPA is going to be so long that it might not really even justify marketing actively in a given state. So I think the correction for us, having two publicly traded parent companies has definitely manifested itself in more of a marketing come to Jesus moment rather than product innovation. I think the product development team is always going to be somewhat fixed. I'm not sure if other operators see it the same, but like product is full steam ahead at all times, and we're always trying to get more resource from both our parent companies and in-house as much capability as possible from a development standpoint. But on the marketing side is where you make those course corrections, I think, when the market corrects in the way it does.
One thing I would add to that is that to the extent that some brands pursue product innovation by way of mergers and acquisitions, and at this time last year, a lot of companies were pursuing all stock deals or mostly stock deals that to the acquirees felt very attractive and to the acquirers felt not that dilutive. That entire landscape has changed entirely, and it just is much different to be able to pursue an all stock deal or a mostly stock deal with levels and valuations where they're at today. And to Zach's point, it is not always so easy to expand and contract the product development team in-house, and that's why a lot of companies have looked to acquisitions to formulate and underwrite their own product innovation, but especially the all and mostly stock deals, those have really slowed, if not come to a halt entirely for now.
And of course, we've seen just huge growth in legal sports betting here in the U.S. since the repeal of PASPA, but there's also still a huge segment of the population that does not yet have access to legal betting. This is something we were sort of talking about last week, but what I'm interested to hear from you all. What do you think it actually takes to win over those users in markets where legal sports betting is available from the offshore accounts? Is it about the brand? Is it about the innovation? Is it both? Tomash, yeah, if you want to kick us off.
I have this theory that it's accessibility, right? Like if you think about the sports betting experience, it's not very accessible. What is plus 120? Ask someone who doesn't bet on sports, they don't know, right? That makes the experience inaccessible. Whereas if you walk through a casino floor, what do you mostly see? Slots. Why is slots accessible? Because it just takes a single click and then something happens and it's highly repeatable and you get dopamine every time you spin, right? So this notion of if you plot accessibility on the x-axis and then immersiveness on the y, then you find that sports books are highly immersive because you have money riding on the outcome, but it's not very accessible. And then the free-to-play games that like a pick six game, it's extremely accessible because it doesn't take much to do it, but it's not very immersive because you've done it in 15 seconds and then you forgot about it. It is not changing your experience of watching that game. So how can you create something that is both highly accessible and highly immersive, like the slots experience, right? Is the key kind of question to ask about what the next generation of sportsbook products is going to look like.
I would just add, I think for as long as the offshores are providing credit betting, people will be attracted to them. If sports betting is a 7% hold business, in theory, if you're betting responsibly at an offshore book, you only need to put $7 aside to place the same amount of bets that someone on BetMGM would need $100 to deposit in order to place. And on top of that, because the offshore and pay-per-head sites tend to be less strict on KYC, AML, geolocation, and often do not have a payment processing component, the sign up and sign on process is just a bit easier. And so I think that aspect of the accessibility leads to your question. It really is, I think, more of a product innovation and experience battle than a brand-related one.
Just jump in there. The AGA has been running a lot of polls on finding out, how are we doing at converting players that were initially engaging offshore? And what is that? What is the thing that we can do more of to convert them as markets start licensing and passing bills? And one of the interesting things that we have seen is that data has supported that in New Jersey, they have converted the most amount of people. And in the early days, we had done a study and realized that the majority of Americans really don't know the difference between a licensed operator from a non-licensed operator. And so there has been also a lot of discussion in our industry about advertising and is it helpful or does it have a negative impact on our industry? But the reality is it has also helped us convert and educate players to what is a licensed operator and get more familiar with these licensed brands that offer them security and protections, protects their community. As a bill passes, legislators are mostly concerned about, are people of age that are participating? Is there going to be protections against fraud? And is there going to be some mechanisms for responsible gambling? And that's really the questions that enable each of these states to open. And so I think that there is a lot of innovation that still needs to happen and communication that needs to happen with the media to make sure that they're only publicizing odds from licensed, reputable gaming providers. And that's something that's actually come a long way just in the last 5 years. And we've been having these conversations about the legal US market for quite a while. So because players have been interacting with these brands for so long, and they don't know that when they use their credit card that it's being miscoded.
Right. They
And-
just know it's legal in New Jersey, so wherever I can bet, it's likely legal.
Exactly. And so that like experience that the average American is having is still something that we need to engage in order to educate them to play with BetMGM.
Thank you. Yeah. The only thing I would quickly add is, a paperhead or an offshore book is generally not going to give you a deposit match after you've played through a certain amount of money. It's generally not going to give you a free bet if you had a bad weekend on NFL or whatever. So there's a certain amount of retention offers and bonusing that factors into this just because people feel like they're getting an added value from converting into the regulated market. A lot of that's going to go away as, attention turns to profitability and like EBITDA positivity, which I'm sure we talked about in our investor day, which is going on right now. And you start to optimize your bonusing. But what won't go away is if you can find other ways to plug into things that customers are already doing, like the MGM rewards program, right, where they feel like they're getting added value for converting to a certain regulated book versus another. And, in DraftKings, it might be their swag room or whatever, all of those added value incentives that offshore books just simply can't offer is probably a big factor. But I totally agree with Lloyd. There's a certain amount of people that the lure of betting on credit is just, and the seamlessness of the journey because they don't have these regulatory requirements is you're never gonna get over that. You need to figure who that is and just avoid marketing to them in a wasteful way.
Just as we wind
right.
down here, I think, does anybody in the crowd know who Bruce Linton is? Show of hands, nobody. He's the founder and CEO of Canopy. It's about a $15 billion publicly listed company. He's probably the single most progressive person who legalized marijuana in the US. He's an investor in our company. The reason he's an investor in the company is he thinks over time, it's not just regulatory change, but consumer habit change that moves from illegal to legal. And he said, just be patient. And we have time on our side. And so I think there's a couple things here. First is the current cohort of bettor. If we just took that as a pie chart and said, do they know the difference between legal and illegal? Probably correct. They don't, and they don't probably care. The piece that we're fighting over is not the current cohort of bettor. It's the other, 280 million who haven't placed a bet yet. And that's much more interesting to me. And it's the people who wouldn't smoke a dodgy cigarette unless they can buy it from somewhere that they know it's not going to kill them. And so I think that the idea of it being legalized is part one, but part two is actually we're changing who's going to be smoking dodgy cigarettes or placing online bets. And we can do that because we can communicate with them differently and we can help create franchises that create trust. But I think that, I just saw Bruce 2 weeks ago, and he would say probably the number one ingredient in that is time.
Well, it's an optimistic note to end on. Thank you very much for our panelists for being here.